From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
All right, we are back, and we're going to jump to an email we got from, I'm going to use your name, Robert. Here it goes. Go ahead and use my name. My NSA agent probably knew I would send this before I did. I did, Robert, so you and your NSA agent, there you go. That's your name, Robert. He says, I won't mention anyone else's name, though. I know several ex-military that when they came back from deployment have complained about PCs, that's private contractors, and how they don't have to play by the same rules because they were there as private protection contractors and not as a country's armed forces. Some of them, after serving their time, have decided to get out instead of re-upping, going back, but then got a job as a PC and went right back to where they had just left. So I guess leaving their military service, then going back to the same place they were as a private military contractor. The ones I've asked why basically said that now they will finally get to shoot the bad guys and do the stuff they could not do as a soldier, and the pay is much better. Much, much better, he says. So how does this apply to me? When serving as a member of the U.S. Armed Forces, they have strict rules of engagement that prohibit them from being the aggressor or keep them from protecting the citizens living around them if they themselves are not threatened. It's very frustrating, and even more frustrating if a PC, a contractor, can shoot a known bad guy without it being an act of war. I think most who see this and are frustrated that they can't do anything about it are motivated to become private contractors themselves so they can go and do what they couldn't do themselves. To me, it's scary because it floods the market with hired guns. Okay, Robert, thank you so much for writing in and for telling us about your experience. On this show, we've talked about private military contractors before, a bit briefly, I think, in the audio side. We've got several videos you can go check out if you wish to kind of get a basis of knowledge around this topic. Or, maybe you have some experience yourself. Our coverage prior to this has largely been on that line that Robert is describing to you here, between what's the difference between a military officer or, a soldier in a military and then a private contractor who is working on behalf of that military, and what rules apply to these two different people, and what, in practice, what does that look like? And some of the best examples that we've gotten before in the past in looking at this came from the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, the most recent war in Iraq. I don't know if everyone remembers this, but back in the day, there was a massacre that occurred in Iraq at the hands of some Blackwater employees, private military contractors who were there in Iraq. And it was when the reporting came out about it, it was very harrowing. It was an awful thing that occurred. And originally, Ben, help me with this, but originally when the story broke, it felt as though these men weren't going to be tried, or they weren't going to be getting in trouble initially. And I think that's why there was such an outcry for it, because there were these civilians in Iraq that got massacred by private military contractors, and it seemed like there wasn't going to be any justice.
Talking about the Nisour Square massacre?
That's correct.
2007, Blackwater, yeah.
And that was just initially what occurred. I'm having a hard time even recalling back to this time. Was that 2007?
Yes, that's correct. 2007.
Okay, so that was right before Stuff They Don't Want You to Know became a video series. And, we were still looking at this stuff and talking about it in the first several years of this show. But it was a rough thing to even think about, that the United States was sending over members of the military that were mercenaries. That you can think about it that way. These private military contractors are mercenaries. human beings with guns that have a mission to do a certain thing depending on what they're told to do.
For pay.
For pay, yeah. And the reason why I think it's important to address right now is because something happened about a month ago that applies to those specific Blackwater employees or former Blackwater employees who have been in jail for a long time, quite a time. They were pardoned by the outgoing president, Donald Trump. Now, the reason why this is news is because it was 17 innocent civilian citizens who were gunned down in 2007. And then for the, the top official, the leader of the country that represented the killers to say you are pardoned, it feels like a massive blow.
It does, and just to be completely clear, they were tried and found guilty in a civilian court, right?
That is correct.
So, they would not have had the same protections, I guess you could call it, as actual members of the military who would be tried internally or court-martialed or what have you, based on whatever metric the Army uses to decide whether something is a war crime or just collateral damage. So this really blurs that line, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And, we're not going to sit here and tell you it's an easy situation to deal with threats when you're operating in the field somewhere, no matter who you are, if you're military or private contractor. It's not easy to assess dangers that are around you. And it's not always a black and white situation when, you have to fire your weapon or you decide to fire your weapon. But in this particular circumstance, I think it's a little easier to see that there were unnecessary deaths that occurred here. And, again, it's easy for me to say sitting here behind a microphone as a guy who's never been in combat, but good God, it's tough. Anyway, we don't have to get stuck on the pardons thing, which is worth your time if you want to look that up. What I do just want to continue talking about is the future of private military contractors, other instances that have occurred where contractors have done something that they shouldn't have done and either gotten away with it or, we just don't know about yet. I think it would be worth it for everyone listening right now and for us personally to look into that stuff further. And we would love to hear from you if you're listening out there and you have experience.
Matt, what was it that led this to be such a big news story? Obviously, it was reported, so there were journalists present, something happened, and to your point, I feel like stuff like this could happen in a vacuum, and we'd never hear about it. But what about this particular case caused it to be such a, create such a public outcry?
I feel like such a dunce here, Ben. Was it not leaked as part of a WikiLeaks thing? I feel like that's how I remember learning about it. I know it's not the Iraq War tapes. I'm just having a hard time recalling because so many things were coming out from WikiLeaks around that time. Around 2008, 2000, or maybe it was 2009. But it was just, I remember watching the video footage of some of it and reading the stories when we made those videos, Ben, and it just.
Well, we know that the New York Times reported on this in 2007.
Got it.
September 27th. And there were guards who witnessed the incident who also, Blackwater guys, who said that they felt the shootings were unjustified. And then journalists began digging around and seeing some increasingly troubling things about oversight. The number of incidents wherein Blackwater employees were firing first, regardless of circumstance. One of the reasons this was such a big deal, these pardons on December 22nd, 2020, is because the people who got pardoned had been sentenced to, one of them had been sentenced to life in prison. The other three had been sentenced to 30 years in prison each. And that was in 2015, because they went to trial in 2014. And this was a long legal saga. So They served about 5 years, if you want to call it that, a little more than 5 years. And this was seen as a profound insult to the family members of the victims, as well as Iraqi citizens in general, where, as you can imagine, the U.S. has not the best reputation. It also brings up, and I think this is what this is what you're talking about, Robert. It brings up some of these even larger questions about the role of private contractors, or if you want to call them mercenaries, in what their role is in a state military or state level armed forces, armed service. Because, I don't know if you guys remember what's called the Rent-A-Coup scandal.
I do not recall that. What is that?
This is the accusation of, you can read a great thing by the Brookings Institution on this, called Outsourcing War. And this happened before the events that we're talking about with Blackwater. The idea was that the private military industry would give several things: plausible deniability, right? So you can say it wasn't necessarily our country attacking you. It would also blur the lines between civilians and soldiers, which, terrorism does that too, right? And then it also had a profit motive. It can make a lot of money for some people, not for everybody, but it can make a lot of money for people. And at least according to Brookings, the private military industry, it's very much a thing, emerged at the start of the 1990s. But I would be very careful with that. You could say maybe the modern private military industry emerged at the start of the 1990s, but the history of war is lousy with mercenaries. Like, it's a real thing. And also, just to be completely fair, when we say mercenaries, we're talking about people who are in active hot combat, right? Direct conflicts. A private contractor or private military contractor is not always that. They could be someone who's tasked with repairing vehicles, right? They could be someone who's tasked with driving a truck somewhere in a foreign country. There's not all of these people are like ex special forces or something like that. It's very important to make that distinction.
It reminds you of Halliburton and all the people who were
right.
in Iraq and Afghanistan building bases.
Mm-hmm. Or people who have decided to take, I don't know, it's tough because you could argue there's something similar with the revolving door in the defense industry, right? You put your time in, you get to a high enough level in Uncle Sam's organization, and then you, just on the strength of your connections, join a private organization. But so now you've got to sell all these new missiles. You've got to sell this new this new helicopter armament or module. So you are the person who knows Senator Farfignugan, right? Because you worked together when you were in the Army. So people will pay you easily $500,000 just because you know that guy, and you can call him and say, you know what's really kick ass? This new stuff we have for Apaches.
Farfel is always good with the Apache stuff. I noticed that.
Well, I think it's important for us to say, like, when we're talking about this private public practice, not everybody involved is a soldier. And I think it's also, it's still troubling from like the halls of Washington all the way out to the most remote locale you could imagine. This is troubling because it can make a double standard. You know what I mean? And then what happens in negotiations when two countries or two groups are trying to reach a peace accord of some sort, and they say, okay, look, you need to answer for this war crime that was committed. What happens when the negotiator is like, well, that technically wasn't us. We paid them, but it wasn't us.
Yeah, what happens when it's not a private military contractor anymore and it's an Alphabet Boston I was about to say Boston Market. Boston Dynamics.
Boston market is huge in international conflict. That's their main stream of income, I think, right?
But like a Boston Dynamics creation. What if it's one of these robots that's, carrying out missions the same way a private contractor would, and it malfunctions or does something incorrect? Who gets blamed then? That's what our future is going to look like. I think it's worth us talking about this more, and we should.
Well, I wanted to ask a quick question of both of you guys. What are your thoughts in general on the institution of the presidential pardon? I know that's a big question, but it's always like kind of skeezed me out a little bit. It's like, did you break the law? Were you convicted? Then that should stand. Like it feels, I know maybe it's harder to swallow when it's something that feels unjust like this. And there are certainly people that perhaps have been wrongfully convicted where a pardon makes sense. This one did not feel that way. But in general, it seems like an awful lot of power for one person to just unequivocally wield with no oversight.
It's kind of weird because it ends up being your personal perspective and the perspective of the president, right? And that's really the only thing that comes into it. I wish it was more limited. I wish it was fewer pardons could be given out,
Is there a hard number?
I don't. If there is, I don't know it. But I've never seen anyone say, "Whoa, slow down on the pardoning, Mr. President."
No, yeah, there's no explicit hard number. The biggest limiting factor is that you can grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the U.S. except in cases of impeachment. Now, remember, impeachment can apply to like a member of the judicial branch as well. Mm-hmm. So. That's what you cannot touch with this. It was controversial from the time from the time of its inception. People like George Mason said he had this. I think it was Mason had this quote where he was basically saying, "Look, pardons make sense if every president is as good as George Washington. And let's be honest, my dudes." Not all the presidents that come after him are going to be as good as this guy. We kind of lucked out, and everybody's like, "No, come on, man, we're doing a country thing. It's going to be great. We're start a country bit." So yeah, pardons.
Well, and even then, like imagine in the Revolutionary War, if you're going to pardon someone who was working for the country, who was would be considered a patriot by many. But maybe that person killed, 15 people in an effort to create that country and fight for the formation of the United States. Some people are going to think that person should stay in jail forever or do whatever, remain. This is completely made up. I'm just saying, like, you're going to have differing viewpoints. It's the freedom fighter terrorist thing, right?
Well, also, with I don't want to derail us here, but with the idea of a pardon, you'll hear it being portrayed as a mechanism for combating corruption, for a flawed judicial process. Because remember, the primary threat or the primary potential for corruption in the judicial branch is the fact that judges are often appointed rather than elected. And, if you get ring wraith status and you're one of the Supremes, then you're in there for life or until you cry, Uncle Sam, I guess. So there is this, it's meant to, and I think it's well-intentioned, it's meant to give the executive branch the ability to directly combat corruption in some other way. And it plays a huge role, or like clemency as well, plays a huge role when we talk about capital punishment, which the U.S. has just historically not done a great job with, right? And you can go back after you've killed an innocent person and admit that you killed an innocent person, but they're still dead, So there's a lot riding on this. But pardons are, I think pardons are still going to be controversial for a long time, regardless of the administration.
Agreed.
Yep.